Watching a few of the surviving films of the German director Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau, a certain pattern within his German films concerning the way characters move became apparent to us. What we refer to as his German films are those which were executed before 1927 and therefore belong to the German-based phase of his career and can be placed within the contemporaneous tradition of German Expressionism. Through this scrutiny of this group of films, we will argue for the presence of a pattern in the approach taken towards the representation of the characters' ways of walking, as we believe this recurrence is notably found in them. The acting style proper of German Expressionism generally encompassed great dramatic gestures, built upon the previously existing Expressionist performing arts, highlighted by the chiaroscuro, which juxtaposed strong lighting and dark shadows. This intense atmosphere and theatrically acting quickly became widespread and characterized to a certain extent all of Murnau's German films. On top of this, it is what revealed to us the existing of a pattern in movement. Unlike many other Expressionist films, Murnau's German films seem to us to be inhabited by especially one very peculiar character, someone who stands out for his way of being, and more specifically, walking. The first hunch led us to further observations and to the subsequent discovery that in most cases this peculiar character seemed to be the antagonist, with the exception of the situation in which there isn't one, in which case the chosen character would then be the protagonist. Is there indeed such a pattern? And if so, did it emerge intentionally? Through our analysis and split-screen comparisons between the antagonist's ways of walking in Murnau's Nosferatu, The Last Laugh, Tartuffe and Faust, our aim is to demonstrate the existing of such pattern and to try to tackle the reason behind its appearance. This would be done in order to answer the question of why would Murnau put so much visual focus on the antagonistic figure, especially when all these films don't seem to be praising them and always end with their defeat. Even the depressed grotesque side of the porter in The Last Laugh will eventually be conquered by luxury and joy. 3 out of the 4 characters we will be analyzing are interpreted by the highly praised Emil Jannings, who to date is still the only German to have won an Academy Award for Best Actor. One could therefore potentially argue that the similarities in the extreme way of acting could be provoked by the fact that the same actor impersonates most of our examples, but 2 factors lead us to a different conclusion. The first reason is Max Schreck. The German actor is best known for playing the role of Count Orlok in Nosferatu, and his movements perfectly fit our pattern. As we will show, his way of walking drastically stands out from the rest of the cast and makes him the most peculiar character of the film. The second reason is Murnau's approach to filmmaking. In her book Murnau, the writer and film critic Lotte Eisner provides passages from Murnau's and Karl Mayer's scripts for Nosferatu and Tartuffe. The screenplay writer Mayer collaborated extensively with Murnau and greatly contributed to the delineation of the characters we will be analyzing. The reason why we consider this text as an additional evidence for our argument is because Murnau and Mayer always noted down in a detailed manner when and how the characters move. The reason why we consider this text as an additional evidence for our argument is because Murnau and Mayer always noted down in a detailed manner when and how the characters move. When looked against the overall highly general and poetic nature of the script, the ways in which the characters move stands out as described very carefully. With regard to Tartuffe's character description, Eisner says Mayer gives a long description of him creeping down the stairs, his mouth open with desire, step by step, on tiptoe but heavily. We will offer more relevant examples, but this evident precision in the description of the movements proves that the peculiar way in which these characters move was not only a consequence of acting skills of the actors who portrayed them, but more importantly of the directing and decisions of Murnau and Mayer. One of the traits of Murnau's films, which was and still is considered distinctive of his, is the communication of interior feelings, as writer Marilyn Fabe refers to them. From the very beginning, film critics located the origin of this notion in various elements, which Fabe also explores. She states, in his groundbreaking film The Last Laugh, Murnau achieved expressionistic distortions of the cinematic world, not by photographing painted expressionist sets, but by capitalizing on the expressive capacities of the cinematic apparatus, extreme camera angles, special optical effects, and the exuberant camera movements. This is all true, but what most of these investigations do is neglect the contribution of the actor and specifically movement. Although they put so much emphasis on how the camera's movement conveys emotions, they look over how the actor's body very importantly portrays his or her inner state. The way in which the 4 characters we are analyzing walk can be subdivided into different categories of similarities based on a few factors. The first group is formed by Count Orlok, Tartuffe and the porter, after he is deprived of his uniform. These characters characters are comparably due to the fact that they are slowly ambulate. Their roles could not be more different, but the way they walk is outstandingly similar. Count Orlok approaches everything at a slow pace. Hatta in the castle, the men on the ship, the city, and lastly Helen. His means of transportations also seem to move at a similar pace. First the ship across the sea, and then the little boat across the small river that leads to this house. His walking is rigid and his legs move stiff, slowly but steadily. He brings himself and death upon the city. Indeed, Professor Gilberto Perez refers to the Count Orlok's character by saying, toward his prey he advances with surveying slowness at the shivery sober pace of inevitability, and then tiptoeing in the quiet streets, slinking through the deserted squares in order not to disturb the town's sleep. He also refers to the ship with the phrase, the phantom ship makes a slow, inexorable, culminant entrance. Likewise, Tartuffe's character also gradually enters the scenario. He navigates the house in a judgmental and secretive manner as he hides his face behind his book of prayers and drags his seemingly unable to move faster body. His painful initial dragging of his feet strongly resembles the porter's after he is stripped off his uniform. Both of these characters, played by Janning, walk equivalently slow and both only for part of the storyline. Tartuffe debutes the film with such a stroll, which is supposedly connected to his rigid commitment to his faith. The porter, on the other hand, grows into this arduous way of moving after he has lost his position and therefore status. In fact, his initial attitude and appearance would probably not have been classified as peculiar, as his perky walk fit the overall bubbly atmosphere. At the beginning, he walks upright with his arms straight and strong along his side, pushing his chest out with confidence. But once he loses his job, he goes from slightly leaning backwards to forward. When he's handed his new uniform and pile of sheets, he crouches over with his arms bent just enough for him to be able to carry them. He miserably drags himself around for the loss of his status. When he steals back his uniform, he leans forward for fear, sneaks through the hotel, then anxiously runs through the streets before he dramatically collides with the wall. The change Tartuffe's character undergoes is less gloomy, but more wicked. Indeed, once he gives into sin and makes a move on his devotee's wife Elmire, his change in pace is great and sudden. All at once he moves faster than any other character as he tries to hide to avoid Orgon's confrontation. Both the porter and Tartuffe will then go through one last movement shift. Once Tartuffe is exposed, he bends over ashamed, crouching to the side, whereas the porter, after extensive suffering, stumbles upon the fortune, and as he does, he regains posture and strength. The transformation Tartuffe goes through leads us to the second group, only formed by himself and the character of Mephisto, who are connected by the obscure and sneaky way of walking. Janning's performance in both roles conveys their respective devilish intentions, once again through crouching, but this time with additional speed. For Tartuffe it's a phase, for Mephisto it's his nature. When Mephisto first appears to Faust, he is static but extremely theatrical in his poses and facial expressions. His dark nature is clearly visible, but his way of walking will only later clearly portray it. As the story advances, he is always looking over what Faust is doing and over his own shoulder. Although he has not fully proven his evil essence yet, his being on edge gives him away. This constant uneasiness and creeping around is what makes him stand out. Before proceeding further, a clarification has to be made. We begin our analysis stating that the characters we would be scrutinizing would be the antagonists of their respective films, but this is not the case for the porter in The Last Love. Although he is the protagonist, he nevertheless fits our scheme as there's no official antagonist extensively shown on screen, and he could be regarded as his own enemy. As previously introduced, Eisner's text on Murnau's and Meyer's writing and directing provides an additional insight which proves the degree of control that the two men had over their films, but also hands over many of their annotations on the ways of walking. Tartuffe's script states, stern, threatening in its rigidity, the black silhouette of Tartuffe cuts across all these delicate tones. And Eisner himself states on Count Orlok, in the film Murnau shows Nosferatu without the coffin raising up slowly and stiffly, which gives a much more supernatural effect. Someone was paying attention to the actor's movement, but in a larger spectrum the topic was mostly neglected. Why is this so? When such a pattern is indeed present and apparently intentional, the most plausible reason would be because of the greater importance of the other elements, such as camera movement and special effects. Murnau's innovations must have overshadowed the topic we are dealing with. Now that the pattern has been made visible by visual comparison and analysis, we will delve into the question of why would Murnau put so much emphasis on the way in which one specific character moves. Discussing The Last Love, Professor Sabine Müller reported how critics admired the film's capacity to draw the viewer in and to let them participate in the protagonist's misfortune. This sentence summarizes the added value that people awarded to Murnau's films, a deep emotional connection. The author Scott Amon describes as expressionistic Murnau's twisted and tormented characters. but very importantly adds Murnau's own quest for the perfect melding of meaning and movement. It is the inclusion of the word movement which leads us to our conclusion that Murnau visually focused on one specific character, his physicality and his way of moving in order to reach an emotional participation from the viewer's side. The theater director Vsevolod Meyerhold was one of the most energetic supporters and advocates for the use of expressive movement. He strongly believed that the actors were to use their physical strength and capabilities in order to communicate emotions to the spectators to such an extent that they would provoke a response. The author Adriano Daloia associated such an approach to the term kinesthetic empathy, which involves the viewer in both an emotional and motor manner. Despite his or her consciousness of the fictional nature of the filmic events, this participation is mostly realized via the activation of empathy, a factor that reduces the psychological separation between the spectator and the characters. This empathic effect was recognized and highly appreciated by contemporary reviewers, and their enthusiastic words prove indeed that the added emotional layer was strongly linked to character performance. One let the images pass by, had no time to think, experienced the events empathetically, felt wholly captured by Yannick's performance. Murnau enters tactfully and lovingly into the psychology of this old woman. The kinematograph. For Murnau, events are not always incidents, but transformations of emotion. Although these reviews point at the character's role in conveying emotions and being the producer of empathy in the viewers, they do not refer specifically to movement, and therefore kinetic empathy. But as our visual analysis has shown, the personality traits as well as story developments are clearly conveyed by the ways in which the four characters we have taken into consideration work. Tartuffe's austere secrecy, then overpowered by his libido's outburst. Count Orlok's slow approach, which comes upon the town just like death inexorably will. Mephisto's evil and malicious nature, which constantly has him sneaking around and looking over his shoulder. And the porter's loss of his comfort zone, which probably leads to the most radical change in way of walking. His facial expressions, camera movements and special effects undoubtedly convey his emotional status, but his body already says it all. Author Eric Routh defines the notion of telling gesture as an action of the body unfolding in time and thus expressing some meaning or content, to then discuss it with regard to the character of the porter. His condensed summary of the porter's transformation suggests that the fundamental importance that the body and movement retain. His head leans dejectedly when he painfully returns the borrowed uniform. He collapses in the manager's office after receiving the letter demoting him, slumps and slows eating his soup in the washroom, crouches and hunches over when evading the night watchman to retrieve the source of all outward respect he puts on for his daughter's wedding. What has to be noted is that we do not necessarily argue that Murnau aimed at making every movement evoke a specific emotional reaction. The movements themselves might aim at evoking some sort of reaction, perhaps a very primitive emotional response. We have to consider the possibility that Murnau had in mind what the author Maxine Sheets Johnston named thinking and movement, and defined as not to regard movement as a vehicle for thinking, that is, as a means by which thoughts emerge, but rather the thoughts themselves, signification of the flesh, so to speak. She discusses Merleau-Ponty's thoughts of language to make sense of the concept of thinking and movement, coming to the conclusion that movement must somehow cease to be a way of designating things or thoughts and become the present of that thought in the phenomenal world, and moreover not its clothing, but its token or its body. The aim of the kinesthetic empathy might then have been kinesthetic empathy, but why would then Murnau consistently chose the antagonist as carrier of this meaning? The reason why this question arises lies within the film's nature. In fact, as Professor Julian Harnich observed, there is an added layer to that of somatic empathy due to the fact that the actors impersonating fictional characters provoke in the audience an imaginary roleplay. So on top of the viewer sharing with the fictional characters, the notion of having a body, meaning the embodied knowledge, which is what sparks the somatic empathy. The two share something on the fictional story level. Does this therefore mean that Murnau wanted the audience to imaginatively impersonate the antagonists on his films? Our conclusion is that this is not the case, and we will explain why we believe this through the notion of positive and negative Einfühlung, also discussed by Harnich. The Einfühlung or empathy can be positive or negative, as viewers in the audience are widely different. Not everyone is going to relate to the subject portrayed on the screen in the same way, because we humans differ from each other in all sorts of ways. A grown woman, a young boy, and an old lady would have all perceived Count Orlok in a distinctive way. But what Harnich suggests is empathy readiness, which will allow the viewer to experience the film fully. No matter the character or the action he or she is carrying out, the audience has the potential to empathize with him or her, at least on a somatic level. As cinema and media theorist Vivian Sobchak states and Hanich reports, all humans share the general conditions of embodied existence, meaning that although the audience and the characters on screen are not in the same place at the same time, they still experience the universal notions of temporality, spatiality, intentionality, and reflexivity in the same way. Although we might never be to know for sure, our conclusion is that Murnau's focus on a specific character's way of walking was sparked by the desire to create a somatic effect and bodily link between film and audience, which was to generate an emotional response. And the decision to accord theatricality, especially to one character per film, was probably designed to achieve a stronger and sharper emotional response, whichever this would be. During the last 15 years, notions such as event, aesthesis, experience, synesthesia, and empathy replaced terms like representation, sign identification, and desire. As film phenomenologists have aptly demonstrated, the notion of representation is too distant, too static, too steerly, and too strongly focused on vision to account for the pleasure our bodies experience in certain filmic moments. To a considerable degree, the cinema addresses the other senses as well. It brings into play the lived body as whole.